I'm talking to Redfern Jon Barrett. Can you just introduce the listeners to yourself, please?
Oh, yeah, great. I'm Redfern Jon Barrett. I'm a writer and activist. I tend to write science fiction and literary fiction from queer perspectives. And yeah, I live in Berlin. I'm polyamorous. I just run through a mental checklist of all of the interesting things I can think of about me. I have two boyfriends, that counts. I'm originally from Britain, but I've lived in Berlin for almost 10 years now. So, yeah, I think that's a rundown of the main points about me.
Yeah. Well, I've got the book that I want to talk about today. Is The Giddy Death of the Gays and the Strange Demise of Straights. I hate that this is the first question, but I just have to ask because the front cover, the face, says the strange demise of straights, but on the spine it says the strange demise of the straights, which is the correct one.
It's of.
Are they both correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's off straights, but I mean, with a title that length, it's, you're never going to get every single word right. As long as it's vaguely the same words in vaguely the same order, it's good enough.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, titles are very nebulous. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of the title of something that people get wrong all the time, but I'm blanking on that front. So I saw in another interview that you did. You described the book as polyamory propaganda. Yeah, which struck a chord with me. I was like, that's pretty funny because I've actually did some reflection as I was reading this book and realized I actually know in my social circles 3 different polyamorous groups. Yeah, of varying types. So I'm pretty sure most of them are closed, but I think one of them might be open. But I haven't really asked for details. But
Yeah.
Um,
It can be a bit awkward.
Yeah, it can be a bit awkward, but it kind of like because especially with some of my experiences with relationships, I haven't been in a polyamorous relationship before. However, it is a little bit more nebulous than the ways that the heteronormative culture will tell you relationships are growing up.
Yes.
It's not just find someone, get married, have kids, white picket fence, that whole type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have those assumptions. I think that's there's so many different ways of being polyamorous and being in polyamorous relationships. I think often that there's probably as many ways of being polyamorous as there are polyamorous people. Whereas of course, that's a huge difference from a kind of social ideal where everything is laid out for you before you've even started dating. You have an idea about what your romantic life is going to be like. And with polyamory, of course, that utterly does not exist. And especially with it still being relatively uncommon, you don't have a lot of examples to work to, which can be a good thing because you have to actually think about how things work for yourself, maybe. But at the same time, it's quite nice. One of the main motivations behind writing The Giddy Death of the Gays and the Strange Demise of Straights is it's quite nice to have some cultural representation, to be able to actually see relationships that may be somewhat like your own when that's not very common for you. I think Alison Bechdel talks about the importance of seeing yourself in the cultural mirror, and that was a big motivation for their writing of queer stories and queer communities. And for The Giddy Death of the Gays and the Strange Demise of Straights, to actually be able to represent polyamorous relationships in a realistic and non-sensationalized way, that was really important to me.
I think because just from where I'm sitting in the media landscape, it seems as though polyamory is one of those things that's still kind of in the process of being normalized. So my sort of barometer is my mother. Mom, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry. Just sort of like people who aren't super deep into LGBT culture. we've reached the point where, gay people, same-sex relationships are, particularly normalized. If you go up to average Joe, maybe they'll have a couple of homophobic beliefs here and there, but generally they'll be accepting. We're currently through the process of normalizing transgender people, and further behind that we've got non-binary people. But I still like for some people who I know who are very open-minded, like they'll accept gay people, they'll accept transgender people, they're open to learning about non-binary people, but they still kind of have a little bit of an ick reaction to the idea of polyamory, because I think it's like closely tied to the idea of promiscuity, which it's not the same thing.
This is a really interesting point for me. I first brought this up. I was debating polyamory at UCL's debating society, and one of the points that I think really, really needs to be made about polyamory is there's a lot of parallels with LGBTQ debates that occurred a few years ago. And one of the main ones of those, and I recognize this as a queer person, is the sexualization of our relationships as a way of dismissing them. And all through when I was growing up, homosexuality in particular was defined by sex. It was because it's a lot harder to argue against and dismiss love. It's easy to giggle and shame sex because we're in a culture that's very, very used to doing that. So that tended to be the way in which homosexual relationships were dismissed. And we're seeing the same thing with polyamory now. Polyamory isn't really about the sex. If all you want sex, you can be single and have all the sex you want, or you can be in an open relationship and have all the sex you want. Polyamory, as the name suggests, is about love. And not all of those relationships are sexual, as you see in the novel. But it suits people to reduce everything down to just sex, because sex in itself isn't seen as worthy necessarily or relatable. It's very, very easy to hand wave away. Whereas love is a lot harder to just dismiss.
So is that one of the motivations behind the sort of the relationship that kicks off the both the sort of social turmoil and the polyamorous aspects of the novel, being a sort of a platonic romance between I want to say the two male leads, Richard and Dom, in the novel, because it introduces the idea that romantic love can be totally separate from sexual lust, but that to everyone's surprise, the two the central romance of the book is between two heterosexual guys in this.
Yes.
yeah.
And
Carolyn is part of that as well. But what was the motivation behind how you organized the central polyamorous relationship?
Well, there were two main things behind that, actually. The first was that was the subject of my doctoral thesis. I studied, because one of the things I think is fascinating about love is the way that it changes over time and space. And it changes really dramatically. And not a lot of people are very aware of the fact that before the 18th century, in Western culture, and particularly in Western Europe, love was something that was reserved between two friends of the same sex. You didn't marry for love. And we have a vague cultural memory of the fact that we didn't marry for love. When we think about marriage in the Middle Ages, we think about it as a social and political and economic contract. That's largely what marriage was until around the mid-1700s, when people like Daniel Defoe and other writers from the emerging middle class started to fight for this bourgeois ideal of love marriage. But before that, love was very, very much something that you shared with a friend of the same sex. And that's where the term bedfellow came from, because you would often share a bed together. And of course, how platonic these relationships actually were is up for debate. But certainly there was this ideal of platonic friendship that people of all classes would enter into. And they'd often share a wallet, they'd often live together. And that kind of changed around 1700, when we start to get this kind of mass panic about homosexuality, and there's much more of a cultural awareness around homosexuality. Right, and so same-sex friendship became taboo. Anyway, that was that.
I mean, speaking as somebody who was straight passing for most of his adolescence, like there is this kind of rejection of guys becoming too close a friends, you know.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And that process, women went through the same process, but not quite to the same extent. So it never became as taboo for women to show physical affection towards each other, for example, whereas men always did. And, and it's around that time that kissing as a greeting between men in Anglophone cultures became taboo. So, yeah, there's this huge, huge shift. And in some cultures, they still have this culture of romantic friendship. If you see a lot of Middle Eastern cultures, for example, it's not uncommon, despite being a very homophobic society, it's not uncommon for men of same-sex friends to hold hands. And you see that here in Berlin, and I think it's really sweet. Like a lot of the Turkish and Lebanese community, you'll see guys, sort of showing physical affection to each other on the bus. I think that is something that is very nice. And I think it's kind of sad in a way that we've lost that. Because I think for heterosexual men, there's really not many avenues for non-sexual affection. Heterosexual men, it's still not as common for them to have close friends with other women who aren't female partners. And it's certainly still taboo, although it's lessening, for two heterosexual men to show affection to each other, physical affection. So I think that's kind of sad that there's no space for heterosexual men to have affection in a context that's not sexual. And so that was something else that was a motivation for the novel and for the storyline. And on top of that, there was also my own experience, which is why I studied the PhD topic that I did. And that was, even though my sexual preference is mostly homosexual, I fell in love with a woman. And it was a very, very deep, very, very, very close relationship, but it was a non-sexual one. And that really, really, I didn't expect that. And that challenged a lot of the assumptions I'd made around my own identity, because to be gay, for example, is to fall in love with just men and to form relationships with just men. And that caused a lot of a great questioning of how I identified and the kind of relationships that I built. And that was also a motivation behind the novel, this realization that actually romantic love isn't necessarily bonded to sexual attraction. They can come together, of course, but that's not the only means in which sex isn't the only means by which people go close and by which they show affection to each other.
I do like the idea of incorporating history into this too, because there is a bit of a conservative myth that, LGBT people are trying to alter some kind of, antiquated, or not antiquated, but ancient way that things are supposed to be. Whereas if you learn about, history, it's often that LGBT people today are actually reclaiming a lot of things that were squeezed out of society.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think the term is the Flintstoneization of history.
Oh yeah.
Our modern values are stamped on the past. You've got people in Viking societies living in nuclear families and things like that.
Yeah, it is always bizarre whenever you're watching a show or reading a book where, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Norse, whoever, and they're all in, one-on-one, man and woman marriages with kids, and you can almost see if they've got white picket fences around the house and shit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and especially when it's even in prehistoric times, people are shown to be living in these little nuclear families, and it's you would get eaten so quickly without larger communities helping you, But I think every culture does this. Every culture throughout history tends to believe that the way that they do things is the way that things were always done. And I think that's one of the great benefits of history and viewing things through a historical lens, is that realization that actually our culture reflects a particular moment in history and geography. And that it hasn't always been like that. And yeah, you're totally right. LGBTQ communities do resurrect a lot of cultural norms and traditions that have been forgotten, because our society is in constant flux.
I feel like we've gone a little bit away from the book. Yeah. So these topics are so interesting.
I'll do it at the top of a hat.
Yeah. You've also got in the book, you've got some sections that flash forward to like this ideal future where
Yes.
the constraints of modern day relationships continue to break down over time, and you've got a lot more polyamory, you've got a lot more sexual freedom, promiscuity, that type of thing, where people just share connections with each other, whether that be physical, emotional, sexual, whatever. And that narrator, because I've written down that the book has 5 voices, even though there are only 4 of them are named. The narrator at that point begins to use the gender-neutral pronouns ze and her to... I still don't know whether I'm pronouncing here correctly, but
yeah, no, that's fine. As far as I'm...
yeah, and it's sort of like, do you see that kind of as a prediction, or something more of like, this would be my ideal future where kind of gender and rigid roles for everyone, including in and out of relationships, continue to break down over time?
I certainly think that it's important in fiction to give people a sense of optimism. And one of the things that I've been talking about recently is this concept of ambitopia. Because dystopian fiction is so big right now, and you can see the attraction of dystopian fiction in the fact that we are living through very, very kind of perilous and changing times. I think it's not a controversial thing to say that I think we're all feeling a bit anxious about the future at the moment. So dystopia kind of scratches a certain itch, but it doesn't really prevent the scenarios it shows from happening. In fact, I'd argue that dystopia makes the scenarios they portray more likely to happen, because they present an image for us and an expectation for the future. So to me, it was really, really important it is still really important in my fiction to present hopeful futures, futures where maybe not everything is perfect, and I think actually, that's what ambitopia is about, presenting futures that aren't necessarily completely perfect, but which give us a sense of optimism even through the muddy times we're living in. And for the giddy death of the gays and the strange demise of straights, that was really, really important to me. The future scenes weren't in there when I first started writing the novel, but I realized 2 things. First, that it was important not to just have a kind of very neat happy ever after ending. There's never an end to our lives and to our stories. So I wanted to follow these characters through the rest of their lives, and also follow the society as it changes around them. And the gender neutral pronouns that are in common use in the future is indicated by the 5th narrator. You're totally right. They're there to present this kind of representation of social change and also sense of optimism. That actually, even though Ruti, who is the other narrator who uses gender neutral pronouns, is quite a pessimistic character, his pessimism is challenged by that 5th narrator. His very bleak view of the future is actually unfounded. His way of seeing things actually becomes more common, and his loneliness and sense of isolation from his way of seeing things, which is present at the start of the novel, that's transformed by 25, 50 years on in the future that's presented.
I'm actually, at time of recording, I'm still writing the script for what I want to do when I talk about this book, and I'm still up in the air about what are Ruti's actual pronouns, because I've noticed that some characters refer to Ruti as he, and he doesn't, and he or they don't object. Although Ruti does say explicitly at some point that he or they is not a man or a woman, but neither or both or something else. But at the end of the book, it kind of rounds out with I think it was Richard, but I'll just open the book right now to finally accepting Ruti's pronouns and referring to them by Z. And so I'm still up in the air of, are Ruti's pronouns he, they, or Z?
Ruti's pronouns. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Well, because the reason why I thought it's probably not Z was because Ruti refers to everyone else using those pronouns. So I thought it was just Ruti's way of removing gender from Ruti's narration, which has its own effects, I think, in literary form that I think are really interesting, and I want to talk about them. But just quickly, what are Ruti's pronouns? Please don't say Z. If I spend the entire video saying Z, it's going to totally undermine my point.
Well, Ruti actually, I think, has a similar relationship with pronouns that I do myself. That was something that I was representing, and it's something that I've thought about more and more as time has gone on. I personally use both they and he, but for me, it's more of an ideological position. I personally, I would like to see a society in which we didn't divide absolutely everything by gender. And one of the arguments that I often use when I'm talking about gender neutral pronouns is, yes, it seems like a natural and fine way of doing things because we've already established that in our society. It's a tradition. But imagine pronouns if we base them in something other than gender. Imagine if instead we used race-based pronouns. Or pronouns based in your religion. Those are no less extreme than basing them in gender, but they sound horrific to us because we don't do it.
Yeah.
So, for me, there's a certain, I would like to see a society in which we move away from gendered pronouns, if possible. I know there's a huge debate about people's use of identity, and I would never force pronouns someone doesn't want on them, which happens to Ruti through the novel. The other characters, many of the other characters don't really like the gender-neutral pronouns that Ruti uses. And, Ruti as a character is... I'm not sure if Ruti would really know the answer to that, because Ruti as a character is who is very lost. And, part of his journey through the novel is exploring... I just called Ruti he. There we go. But
I know trans people who, on accident, will misgender themselves on occasion, so...
I mean, that's a problem. I think part of the reason people get so hostile to gender-neutral pronouns is, I think people fear using the wrong ones. Without realizing that most of us do that. We grew up in a society which used gender-neutral pronouns for everybody. Yeah. So it's quite difficult. You can't just immediately deprogram yourself from 20 or 30 years of using he or she. We all make mistakes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, most people who use pronouns that are not the ones that they're assigned at birth are usually pretty chill if you just misgender them on accident a couple times.
Yeah.
It's something that you kind of have to get used to. But with Ruti's narration, now this was something that was really interesting to me, and actually why I ended up finishing the book and wanting to talk about it is and actually the first time I had to. It took me 2 attempts to get through the book. The first time because the gender neutral pronouns that Ruti was using was actually a little bit difficult to adjust to, but I found it so fascinating that that after taking a break, I came back, read through the book again, and the reason why it's so fascinating to me is because I think it uses literary form to its advantage. So. Because, here's my reasoning. Because when you read a book, you need to replicate the narrator's voice in your own mind. So it's not just that the words are on the page and you read the words. It's that, you have to internalize the words and kind of reconstruct the fiction in your own mind when you're reading a book. Yeah. Literature is kind of the only form where you could force a person's internal voice to adopt those pronouns in order to consume the story at all. Like if it was a TV show or a radio play, you would hear Ruti using those alternative pronouns, and if your mind rejects that, like if you're like, I don't like the sound of those alternative pronouns, then the story continues on regardless, and you could probably make it through the entire thing not making that mental adjustment. But through books, through the written word, the person has to make that mental adjustment in order for them to consume the story whatsoever. And I thought that was actually really, really interesting as far as representing alternative pronouns in book form. And your book is the first that the first book I've discovered to use gender-neutral pronouns. So I don't know if there might be some other books out there that use alternative pronouns. I was reading at some point We Wish You All the Best, which is a book about a non-binary teenager, and the book does use singular they, but because it's written in first person, most of the book you're not getting that singular they, so it wasn't as prominent there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased to hear you say that, actually, because that's something that is really important to me, is that that does get, the reader can get used to those gender neutral pronouns. And you're right, literature does force us to adopt the voice or the perspective of the characters that we're reading in a way that television or movies just can't. There is that remove, there is that distance. So if a character is using gender neutral pronouns and you don't like that, yeah, absolutely, you can dismiss it far easier. Whereas if you're seeing something from a particular person's character and that their voice is in your head, then yeah, that forces you to adopt that as well. It's what makes novels like, say, American Psycho so disturbing, because you're complicit in what the narrator is doing and their worldview. So yeah, it's great to be able to do that with gender neutral pronouns through the character of Ruti, but it does of course present a certain obstacle for the reader when they're first reading it, because it is a big adjustment. It is something that most of us aren't used to and can take you out of the narrative. But it is something that I really, really wanted to put in there, because I wanted the reader to be able to see the world from this perspective, this degendered perspective.
I did actually, there were a few times, I think, where Ruti comes across a character who we haven't seen before and intentionally obscures that character's gender. And it is actually quite, it's quite interesting noticing that as the character whose gender is obscured, does and says certain things, that almost I'm trying to pick up on whether this character is a man or a woman. And yeah. I noticed myself doing that, and it kind of like, reading other people's gender is like such an automatic process that I actually notice when I can't do it.
Absolutely. And, that says a lot about the role that gender plays in our society. Again, imagine if we based pronouns in race. We would immediately want to know the race of a character upon introduction. And not that we don't seek to label and understand people through a whole range of different social identities. Of course, the reader expects to know the race, for example, of a character. But I think gender, it's such an immediacy. From the moment you meet someone, or hear about someone, gender is the first thing that we expect to be told about them.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting for me. It was quite interesting to be able to write a perspective where that's removed, where you're not immediately necessarily told the gender of a character. And I think that can be quite a challenge. I think in some ways it can be a bit of a challenging book to read because of you do one thing, such as removing gender neutral pronouns, and it causes a whole way of reinterpreting the world, and I think that's really fascinating. I was really glad to be able to do that.
Yeah, I thought that the form in this novel is actually quite good. I enjoyed the fact that it has a polyphonic narrator because it has the polyamory perspective.
Yeah.
I feel like you almost have to do that, though. Like if you write a novel with a polyamorous relationship, you almost have to take the perspective of all participants, just out of the spirit of it.
Yeah, actually, the Forget Yourself, the other novel I've had published, also has polyamory and is from a single character's perspective, but it's a character who is very, very kind of self-obsessed in a lot of ways, and it's a much, much bleaker novel than The Giddy Death. The Giddy Death was a hopeful book, and Forget Yourself is much more introspective and a much sadder book. So, and she does overrule other people's, the central characters. She does overrule other people's thoughts and feelings and desires. Whereas The Giddy Death, it really had to be from multiple perspectives, not just because I love fiction from multiple perspectives, but because, I wanted to show the different sides of this relationship, the different characters' reactions to it. And honestly, I really, really just enjoy writing scenes that differ slightly based on the character telling it. I really love that. I love reading them. I love writing them. To show the kind of arbitrary and subjective nature of the world we're in.
Yeah, I did appreciate a few times where we got a scene from one character's perspective and then we go back. It actually starts out like that, I think. The burning of the nightclub, which I forget the name of, if it was named.
Do you know the funny thing? That nightclub, it was based in a real nightclub. It didn't have the same name, but it was based in a real nightclub. It burned down a couple of years ago after the novel was released.
Oh my god! You're a prophet. So, god damn.
What else can I write? What can I make happen?
Can you write a novel where I win the lottery?
But that was a funny surprise when that happened. Probably not for the owners of the club, but
Oh no, uh, that is amazing! Wow.
yeah. So it's a historical novel now.
Historical fiction.
Yes.
It's speculative in nature, maybe. Yeah, I did actually like that the polyamorous relationship doesn't just immediately kind of launch into, a stable relationship immediately. Like there's some resistance
Yeah.
with the characters, and I feel like that is it kind of shows that there is that adjustment that kind of needs to be made either in ourselves or in our social circles or whatever. Some of the characters in the social circle don't like they leave, I think, because they just can't accept the polyamorous relationship and then almost cut ties. Is that based on any personal experience?
I mean, I've actually been quite lucky overall. I think with my polyamorous relationships, I did have. At first there was negative reactions from friends and family. There's a kind of, why are you doing this? Because, I got with my partner Darren 13 years ago. And when we first met, we were monogamous. But then we gradually opened up the relationship and it became polyamorous. We didn't have like an end goal in sight. We just happened step by step. And then eventually we found, why don't we try having relationships? We were both very secure with each other, and I think that made it a lot easier for starting polyamory. But of course, there was this pushback from friends and family who were like, "Why do you want to risk your relationship? This will cause everything to fall apart." And then I think as they saw over the years the relationships and experiences that we were having, there was like this kind of acceptance that I didn't really expect. And for me, the kind of culmination of that was a few years ago. My mum got remarried, and she gave me a +2 to her wedding. And I went to the wedding with both my partners, and we're meeting older relatives who didn't necessarily know, because I hadn't been in much contact with them, that we were polyamorous. Family, friends, the groom's family, and everybody. Some people had some questions, but everybody was remarkably accepting. I mean, you could just argue maybe it's because it's a wedding and everyone's expected to be genial.
Yeah.
But it was kind of like that gave me a lot of optimism for the future, and that's something that I really didn't expect, and I'm very, very pleased by. But I absolutely wanted to get that kind of sense of conflict in, because even though I've had a lot of acceptance from the people immediately around me, I've also had a lot of negativity because of the polyamory. And I've had writers, journalists, and newspapers call me a pervert.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had all sorts of I've had hate mail about polyamory. There's a lot of people they find this very, very threatening, and you could go into all sorts of reasons why do people find polyamory so threatening.
I feel like it's the same thing it's like the same kind of nonsense reaction that they had to gay people initially, where it's like, oh, I don't want them forcing gayness on me. And it's like, how would we even do that? Like, you can just exist in your world as a straight person. And it's like, if you don't want to be polyamorous, well, then just marry only one person,
Exactly. And, for me, the saddest thing was having people who are LGBTQ. I mean, well, not so much the Q part of that. A lot of LGBT people contacted me being very hostile, and would comment on articles I'd read about it being very hostile, and they would use the same arguments that were used against people being gay, lesbian, bi, and queer just a couple of years ago. Yeah. That this isn't natural. We shouldn't buck tradition. This is perversion.
I think there is a and this is going wildly off topic, but I think there is a certain fear amongst certain sectors of LGBT that being associated with certain things might drag down the community as a whole. So it's like, we've fought so hard for gay acceptance, we've fought so hard for bisexual acceptance, we're currently fighting so hard for trans acceptance. If we bring polyamory into this, then, the cisgendered heterosexual mainstream will look at us and go, oh, you're just trying to force polyamory and that was your motivation the whole time, and then that'll sort of regress acceptance of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans. by association. But I mean,
a quick point on that is, sorry, I just finished writing a novel on that exact point.
You finished writing a novel? Oh my god!
Yeah.
Is this something that I can break?
Yeah. I mean, I'm still waiting to hear on a publisher, but it's set in this alternate Berlin that after the Second World War became a gay city-state. And there's bi slums and trans ghettos and queer riots, and it's very, very much an exploration of this idea that, you know, of wanting to appear normal and acceptable, and that's at play in this state, you know, and there's polyamorous relationships are outlawed in this state as well. So I had a lot of fun working with it, but at the same time trying to make like this serious point and examination of this desire for acceptance and how we're willing to trample on difference in order to be accepted ourselves. You know?
Yeah. You know what kind of warmed my heart one day was that there was this a bit of a thing where I think a corporation made an ad that appealed to furries, and immediately my Twitter was filled with people going like, you know what we should do? We should like make the more unpalatable aspects of furry more visible so that all the corporations will stay away. Let's try and make out there. Let's not fight for acceptance. Let's go in the opposite direction. There seems to be this kind of thing where it's like if you try and fight for acceptance, you risk gentrifying yourselves. So it's like, you know, if people try and distance themselves from the trans community or the non-binary community, and there are trans people who try and, you know, distance themselves from the non-binary community, it's almost like they've fought for acceptance, and now that they've got some level of acceptance, they're trying to, you know, gentrify themselves to try, almost like a cash in. Like, okay, I've got the acceptance that I wanted, now I'm going to cash that in and say, now I'm drawing the line where normal and acceptable is.
Yeah, there's a strong instinct among people to pull the ladder up behind them, you know. And that was the motivation for Proud Pink Sky, the next novel. And, you know, we see that in all sorts of communities, you know, both in LGBTQ communities, but we also see that in pretty much every marginalized group has its share of people who, you know, are willing to say, you know, we're normal, not like those people.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really sad instinct, but it's a very, very common one.
Is there anything that you really want to talk about the novel?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's a lot of things, but I feel like whenever I'm asked a direct question, my head just suddenly, you know, my mind just goes blank. One of the things that I really, really, really like about that novel is that every single person that I've spoken to who has read it likes and dislikes different characters.
Oh.
And I feel really pleased about that. Like, some people, their favorite character is Dom. Some people, they absolutely detest him, for example. My roommate's favorite character is Richard, and that was quite unique, that not many people had that. Some people love Ruti, some people really dislike Ruti. And I felt really pleased about that. I felt that it's, you know, it did what I wanted, that the characters were like maybe more real, you know, because in real life, you know, we're all acquired tastes. You know, we're always going to have people who like us and people who don't.
I disliked Ruti initially and then warmed up to him over the course of the novel.
I mean, he's very bitter, you know. Ruti is of course themselves. God, I keep doing Ruti themselves is an acquired taste because, you know, they have this kind of cynicism and this bitterness that, again, is challenged by the novel's narrative. But Ruti is also a character who is very open-minded and does really want to be loved and accepted, and is in this environment where he's really, really struggling to find that. And there's a lot of ways in which I personally identify with Ruti, you know, not just because I'm like a queer pagan. I mean, I'm a lot more optimistic than Ruti is, and hopefully less mean. But I think, I hope that Ruti's a character who can grow on people. And also, you know, Ruti in a lot of ways is this kind of archetypal social justice warrior, you know, that the alt-right loves to vilify and demonize. And I think that, you know, I wanted to make Ruti quite abrasive from the outset so that he does, in a way, fit almost this stereotype. But at the same time, you know, his beliefs and his desires come from a very real place. And his desire for a better world is something that is genuine and heartfelt, I think, with Ruti, and is for a lot of people. And that also ties into the novel's politics, because for me it was really, really important that I'm not just writing about queerness and questioning gender identity and polyamory, but it's all of those things in the society that we're living in now. And, the tens, this decade, has been a time of momentous upheaval and has seen a massive resurgence of fascism, which I also really, really wanted to demonstrate in the novel, because it's not just that, these people are finding a polyamorous relationship together. It's the fact they're finding a polyamorous relationship together in a society that is rapidly becoming more divided, more homophobic in many ways, where Islamophobia is absolutely rampant. So I had to demonstrate those in the novel and see, where does polyamory, where does gender identity fit in within this very aggressive, conflicted culture that we currently find ourselves.
The backdrop of Swansea, Wales. Now, I kind of like almost wish I knew more about Swansea, because I feel like it played a thematic backdrop, or played into the themes of the novel. Especially considering, because you're examining the correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a largely conservative city.
Well, I mean, Swansea's interesting. I lived there many years, and it's a city that's very, very, it's culturally conservative, but economically quite left wing. It's this old industrial heartland. But at the same time, even though Swansea is quite a conservative culturally city, you get these amazing pockets of alternity. That I saw a lot of polyamorous relationships in Swansea. There were polyamorous communities and that were set up, and I knew a lot of people who were trans and queer and non-binary and polyamorous within this very, very conservative culture. And because I think of this this social conservatism in Swansea, it meant that actually those communities were quite strongly bonded together a lot of the time. And I was fascinated by the ways in which people built their lives even within this kind of culture.
It is always fascinating seeing like the behind the curtains communities as well. I want to tell you a funny story about Melbourne. So I live in Melbourne, Australia, and in this city, I didn't know this, but we have a cuckoldry community in this city. And the reason I know this is I work at radio. One of my radio co-hosts told me a story where he was asked by somebody who was like in the cuckold community to be his bull, I think the term is, and then his phone number got passed around, and to this day he still occasionally gets a message from somebody saying, "Hey, I hear you're willing to cuckold people. I'm do you want to do it for me and my wife?"
Oh wow.
Yeah. And there's apparently quite a lot of people in this city who engage in that in that particular fetish, and they formed a little community and they pass each other's contacts around.
I mean, that's the fascinating thing. You often don't see these things until you tap into a scene, suddenly you see, oh wow, this is actually not very visible, but there's actually like this huge current, or this. I'm absolutely fascinated by that kind of thing.
Oh, it's sort of like with me. Like most of my family and relatives don't know that I'm a furry, but like if any of them find out, it's going to be like several hours worth of explaining. Because I'm like, okay, well, if you look over here, there's this entire world that people just aren't privy to. It's kind of like that. It's bizarre.
And I think that's why representation is so important as well, because I think, like, for example, being like furry communities, a lot of what people hear about it comes from hearsay and like third-hand accounts and this kind of, again, just titillation that doesn't, it's. But I'm a strong believer.
Whatever gets the most clickable headlines.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
I feel like we've covered most of the things that I want to talk about in relation to the novel, and several other things besides.
Yeah. I really, really appreciate you paying so much attention to this novel as well. Like, thank you so much for contacting me about it.
You're welcome. Lovely. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me. We're coming up on the hour, which is what I wanted. Can you tell me a little bit about this novel that you've just finished writing? Give me the pitch.
Okay, so Proud Pink Sky follows a gay teenager and a straight housewife as they build lives within in Berlin, which is a gay city-state. It's an alternate history that actually the point of divergence actually takes place in the 1600s, but the novel is set in the 1990s, where this gay city-state has been established for about 40 years. And I had a lot of fun writing that. So it's a city that has a lot of conflict and division. The gay government is very, very desperate to be perceived as normal by the rest of the world, and harshly penalizes people for being trans, bisexual, non-binary, polyamorous, a whole host of different things. Because, I had a lot of fun with it because I'm really, really fascinated by urban design. I love cyberpunk. So because Berlin is this gay safe haven in this world, it's got a population not of 3.5 million like it does today, but of about 25 million. So it's a very, very dense city. It's a city built within this concept of high urbanism. I had a lot of fun building this city, but at the same time, using it as a way of showing these real divisions that exist within LGBTQ communities. Divisions that I think all of us have seen who are from those communities, but maybe straight people aren't so aware of. I would really like it if straight people could read this book and maybe understand a bit more about this conflict that sometimes exists between, say, lesbian conservatives and trans people, or monogamous gay people and polyamorous queer people. And so a lot of the novel's conflict and drama revolves around these divisions that become protests and riots and like mini revolutions within this alternate Berlin in Proud Pink Sky.
I just remembered something else I can ask you as well. Just for my audience, do you have any book recommendations for them?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so an author that I'm constantly evangelizing is Marge Piercy. I think that she is one of the greatest science fiction writers that is currently living. And she also, I don't believe, gets enough attention. And a book that I really, really recommend reading is Woman at the Edge of Time. It's set. It was written in the 70s, but it was way ahead of its time. It predates. It anticipates a lot of millennial politics, and it presents us with these like two alternate futures with a dystopia. Which, by the way, the dystopia takes place just within a single chapter, and it kickstarted the cyberpunk genre. William Gibson specifically said that it was an inspiration for Neuromancer. And
I've got Neuromancer sitting on my desk right now, actually.
Oh, nice. Well, definitely read Woman on the Edge of Time. I always forget if it's Woman on the Edge or at the Edge, so you might notice that I keep using both. But it also presents this utopia, which is very queer. Polyamory is the norm. It's a society in which everybody shares everything, but it's kind of post-abundance. It's almost at the level of this kind of Star Trek kind of fully automated luxury communist kind of situation. It's a really, really fascinating book. And Marge Piercy is, she's long written very, very queer works, and I really think she deserves a lot more acclaim than she's currently getting. So yeah, Marge Piercy, Woman on/at the Edge of Time. I thoroughly recommend.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hit the I'm going to stop recording now, so this is going to be the end of the interview.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, just thank you very much.
Thank you too. It's been great.